This is Love Notes, daily devotions from Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. Grace and peace to you. Our text today is Genesis, the 3rd chapter, verses 1 through 13, and verses 20 through 24. It is sometimes called the fall story. It is how the relationship between God and humanity gets broken. The first thing that we want to do when we come across this text, and many others in Genesis and the earliest scriptures of Israel, is to realize that religious stories were ways of answering the deepest questions about life, and every society had them. There's a creation story for every god that was around the Middle East. There's a creation story for the Incas and the Mayans. There's a creation story for the most eastern parts of Asia. They all seek to answer questions that are deeply embedded into the human psyche and heart. This particular story about a snake that tempts Adam and Eve to eat when they've been told not to eat is a story that answers questions. The first question, perhaps, that it answers is, why is it that humans dislike snakes so much? This particular story gives us a rather humorous way of looking at that. Snakes are not liked because, well, they're tempters. They crawl around on the ground because God is punishing them. Are those spiritual truth scientific facts? Not necessarily. But for ancient people, they were important questions about how things were the way they were. More importantly, the questions that are brought up by this particular text include, why do we suffer and why do we have to work so hard to make a living in this world? Why is it necessary for us to sweat and labor to get the corn to grow and the beans to get to harvest? Why is it necessary for us to work and labor so hard to put food on the table and a roof over our head? This answers that question. God did not intend us to be this way, but we in our humanity decided that we wanted to do things ourselves, and that always make things harder. This text asks the questions, how are we different from other creatures? How are we different than my dog, or the cows in the field, or the sheep that we tend? How are we different? And the perspective of this particular story is that we have the knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of past and future, the knowledge that helps us to see things that sometimes we can't handle, and that brings suffering in the world. Sometimes the question that's brought up by this particular text is, why is it that we desire to be like God when we know we're not? And it seems to be it's because we've been created in the image of God, and the creative forces that God shared with us in grace and mercy and in love, well, they lead us to have choices that we make. We can either stay faithful to God or we can go our own way. That's what human freedom is all about. And what does that cost us? Sin enters the picture in this particular part of Genesis. Sin is nothing more than anything that separates us from God, be it our own choices, our own desire to be our own God, the disobedience that comes when we want to do it a different way than it's been given to us. The story of the serpent who tempts Adam and Eve, and when they've eaten of that fruit, find out that they are naked and see differences they never saw before, explains why people don't like being naked around each other. It explains that differences lead us to judge one another, to blame one another, to point the finger at one another. And we know that down to this very day in this red state, blue state, male and female, black and white, and whatever other divisions you want to make world that we've created. This story is not a historical account of a talking snake and a couple of people who got humanity in trouble. This is a spiritual myth, in the best sense of that word, that answers the questions we have about why. Why are things the way they are? As we meditate upon this particular text, we find that God is giving us grace, and God is coming along beside us, even as our eyes are opened and we see the difference between good and evil, now as God does. It is my particular point of view that God tried to keep us from the burden of knowing good and evil. God alone would bear that in the world. But with our eyes open and with our desire to be like God, well, being like God isn't always an easy burden. We now see the world in all of its glory and all of its sadness and brokenness, just as God does. And that, my friends, is perhaps not what God intended. But nevertheless, where God meets us. Amen.